to respect the spirit and intent of the treaties and treaty making, and remain committed to working on the partnership with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in the spirit of truth, reconciliation, and collaboration. And so with all of that, I want to say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all those listening. Welcome to Web3 Warriors, our third LinkedIn audio panel and episode 80, featuring Tipi and Xael, two amazing Indigenous artists who have done some amazing work on the blockchain as well as in their own professional careers, both in the advocacy space, sustainability space, and really just raising up kind of the cultural identity of Indigenous people in Canada. So welcome, Xael. Welcome, Tipi. How are you doing today?
Hi, I'm doing good. How are you doing?
Doing well, doing well. How about you, Tipi?
Oh, I'm good. I'm trying to fight. Like I talked to you a few days ago, David, and you know that I was battling some sort of the pre-illness stage. I think everybody that I talk to is either recovering or in the midst of, or kind of worrying about a flu bug. So heads up to everybody. But yeah, and I just did a whole bunch of, I've got the cinnamon turmeric tea going.
Nice.
No Wike. Dan might know what Wike is, but no.
Yeah, Wike. Some powerful stuff, actually.
Nice. Awesome. Well, I'm glad you're feeling a little bit better, TP. I have been fighting my own little thing as well, but I think I'm good. I'm 100% ready for an awesome conversation. Maybe even learn some things, have a good conversation about the culture and what we can do here in the space. So welcome everyone again to Web3 Warriors. I'm your host, David Karoma. I go by Chrome in the metaverse. We've been looking to host these spaces on LinkedIn as panel conversations on a monthly basis. This is our third one now, and really just trying to reach out to a new audience, kind of obviously on LinkedIn, a little bit different audience, but also just want to have the conversation from a more kind of broad perspective and hearing more voices, whereas our usual weekly kind of podcast is a more one-on-one kind of in-depth look with specific creators. But here we're looking at topics in LinkedIn. And of course, we are on the eve of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada. And with it being that, I thought it would be very fitting to kind of have a conversation around reconciliation. And full disclosure, we actually initially we're going to have the conversation around reconciliation on the blockchain, but TP had mentioned that maybe that's giving the wrong impression, and we should be able to actually have a conversation around what is reconciliation first, and can it happen on the blockchain? Can the blockchain be used to help push it forward? Which I thought was a very important point, and also a good opportunity to educate around, what is the real goal of reconciliation? What are we trying to do? What is, truth and reconciliation as a broad kind of category? And I think it makes sense to try to listen to Indigenous perspectives on like how can we actually achieve this, and is this even still a divisive issue, or do we actually have consensus to move forward and work on reconciliation in a genuine way? So a lot of important kind of heavy conversation to talk about here, and it is something that we as a country, I think, continue to reckon with and continue to try to learn from and do better, as we move forward. So I really look forward to hearing from TP and Xael about their thoughts on that big question. And of course, this is the Web3 Warriors, so we will be looking at how that ties in with the technology, on the Web3 side. Of course, we often take the angle of kind of the artistic and the creator economy side of things, but there's also the economic and financial sovereignty piece of it, and maybe blockchain can play a role in ensuring a more real sovereignty for Indigenous communities, as opposed to maybe relying on some of the traditional banking infrastructure or traditional financial infrastructure. So there's these two kind of major, I would say, parallel tracks, one on the creator economy and one on the real financial crypto blockchain currency opportunity there. So that's just my thoughts on it, but definitely looking forward again to hearing from Xael and from Tipi. So without any further ado, maybe we will go with a brief introduction first before we really dive into, what is reconciliation. Tipi, I would like to start with you, just a kind of brief background on what you're doing in Web3, as well as just generally, how you approach your Indigenous culture and how you'd like to kind of have this conversation today. But thank you for joining, and please share a brief introduction of yourself.
Okay. So I'm Clarina, and I came into the Web3 space in 2021, actually through Clubhouse by the invitation of my daughter, who's in the audience, Sage. And so I came in and I was really interested in looking at ESGs, and so trying to figure out what that meant as far as being kind of responsible with our investments, understanding activism, and so as somebody that went through post-secondary education in environmental science, put through it was a program that was put through the University of Manitoba and the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, I believe. It was an international, oh, it's a national program, which incorporated Western science, Indigenous through Indigenous paradigms. So there was two professors, one who was a Western professor and one who was an Indigenous professor, and an elder for every single course that would normally be one professor in University of Manitoba. So that was a program that I went through, and so really taking a lot to heart as far as how we interact with our environment through traditional knowledge. Um, that's a whole that entirely is is a lot to unpack. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but and then the other aspect is somebody that I identify as somebody who's been uh, very creative, very art inspired, and in fact had set up a physical store co-op, um, which it ended up closing. I'm not quite sure, understanding. I've talked to you about this, David, but I'm like, businesses, maybe I need some help with finances and stuff. So yeah, that was a challenge for me. But the whole goal of that was it was to inspire some of the cultural arts, and there are some biases that we see. Obviously, when we look at Western science, there's data biases there in measuring impact, understanding and validating different art paradigms through cultures around the world, and Indigenous paradigms is really important to me. And so I came into Web3 really wanting to change that. And I've worked really hard to be an international advocate of multilingual, multimedia artworks, and also to kind of understand what activism means and how we build. And Web3 seems to be a place for me to really find a lot of alignment with those basic principles. So I hope that's a good enough introduction for now.
Definitely. It's great. Thank you, TP. I'll turn it over to you, Xael.
Hi. So I guess being Indigenous and being in the tech world, it kind of has its challenges, and kind of being in the professional kind of world as well. So when I introduce myself um, to people in real life, I usually say, well, I could say that I come from 3 different worlds. I could say I come from like a gaming world. I come from, the traditional world where my parents are always like doing sweat lodges and, going to sun dances and doing ceremonies. And then the third world is, academics, being really serious about, trying, getting an education. Kind of goes back to my grandfather. He kind of advocated for um, us to go to school. So academics has always been kind of a part of my life. I've always been kind of going to school, always since 2007. I've been going to University of Manitoba, taking courses here and there throughout the years. There was a time where I worked with residential school survivors on the tech side. I was able to see a lot of the people that were coming in for counseling, and people that were needing help from certain communities and stuff. And so I kind of have a knowledge of residential school, the intergenerational effects. My father being a survivor, me being, I guess you could say, I'm intergenerationally affected by residential school. Whatever that means to you, take it as it is. But I always think it has something to do with trauma, and having to function in both, you know the traditional world, and the world that has come as a result of our brothers from Europe coming, first settling on this land, and the impacts of that. So that's kind of where I kind of talk in that regard. I have an understanding of community. And when it comes to, I guess, like blockchain, I've been aware of blockchain for a long time, and I was kind of excited to kind of start talking about it recently, because decentralization actually has a lot to do with decolonization. And I guess I'll get into that later, but for now, I'll just introduce myself. In person, I go by Dan Ryder, but on the metaverse, I go by Xael, and been mostly a gamer, my identity most of this time. So hopefully that's a good enough intro for now. Thank you.
That's an amazing intro, Dan. Thank you. Or Xael. From one gamer to another, I met you as Xael before I knew your real name, so we're gonna go with that. But maybe I should just take a step back and do just a brief background because it is a global show. We do have a global audience, and you never know, some people are not as aware of kind of the political and colonial history in Canada, and how we came to this topic of truth and reconciliation as an area of focus, as something that the recent government, I believe, was the first government to really kind of implement this as a national day, and it wasn't out of nowhere. So going back to 2015, there was actually a Truth and Reconciliation Committee report that came out that looked at the impacts of the colonial practices, essentially, which are far-ranging, but specifically on residential schools, especially the idea that back, in the 1800s, late 1800s, all the way through till I believe the 1980s. You can correct me, Karina, if I'm wrong, but it might even be early 90s. Sadly, the government had justified essentially taking children from First Nations communities, Indigenous communities, and forcing them to attend government-sanctioned schools, often run by the church, with the goal, essentially, as explicitly stated, to take the Indian out of the children, which is horrible. And so essentially it was, from my perspective, cultural genocide and an attempt to wipe away a culture's history. And it did, of course, lead to all kinds of horrible abuse, all kinds of really awful things that happen at these schools, including the deaths of children, far too many, and we continue to find graves as well. So going back about 3 years now, 2 years maybe, we had started to kind of unearth graves of mass grave sites, unfortunately, of children at the sites of some of these residential schools. So after that, there was much more focus on the need for healing and the need for something. And then that's where the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation kind of came out. So I think we're on our third now, I believe, National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And so that's just a little bit of background, way too brief, obviously, a lot of different angles to talk about, and there's a lot to it. But all this to say, we are finally, as a country, acknowledging how horrible the residential school system was and how the effects of it basically continue to ripple into today, right? And so the conversation is around reconciliation to heal, essentially, more than anything else, right? It's really about trying to ensure that we as a society can actually move forward and, again, reconcile our differences and be able to speak and to each other. And really, like, the definition in the dictionary is essentially being able to actually have friendly relations with each other. And so with that brief background, I do want to turn it over to Tipi first, because I think she raised this important point when I was first looking at it, like, let's just talk about how the blockchain can help with reconciliation. And then she raised, we have to agree on what reconciliation is first before we can even push things forward. So let's start with that heavy kind of definition, necessary conversation. Tipi, I just want to know, like, how do you view reconciliation, and what does reconciliation mean to you? If you want to share that to get us started here.
It's multifaceted for sure. First off, it was recognized that through the UN that there was attempts at cultural genocide, and it was acknowledged through the Truth and Reconciliation report in the final report, which is one of the reasons why March 2023 was the first time that the Truth and Reconciliation Day was acknowledged as a statutory holiday. So this is not news. I mean, this is not a new issue for us. This is an ongoing issue to speak about. When we talk about reconciliation, I've heard it said through many of my peers that are Indigenous, self-identifying Indigenous, or allies that support the the healing, and this is really important to me. The healing of the Indigenous community comes first, and so you can't reconcile something that has a, you know, we look at what we're surviving, what impacts we're kind of healing in this healing journey, identifying key areas that have major impacts to the communities. There's still a long journey ahead. There's still people that still say get over it. There's still people that are undereducated, and there's a lot of pushback from Indigenous communities to say, why is it our job to educate you? And I think that's a big issue. It does take a toll, and I'll give an example of that. Yesterday, in the blockchain, I was doing a piece of work, and it was about the MMIW, and it was a piece that was for the red dress. I created it for May 5th red dress this year, and my twin sister is at MMIW. Um, and it's really important to me, and my daughter's down there. That's a trauma that's her aunt, and she had to deal with that as a family. My mom is down there, and oh God, I'm going to cry. Hang on.
Yeah, I'm sorry, TP. Please share what you're comfortable with, and I really appreciate you bringing these teachings and histories. These are real impact that people continue to live with, right? And so this is why we have to have this conversation. So, yeah, but please,
Okay.
don't feel any pressure. Don't
That's
feel any
hard.
pressure to overshare, please.
No, I don't feel pressure. I think it's important to say the things that you need to say. I have always said that you can't possibly experience, I mean, does somebody else have to experience this loss to have empathy? I don't think so. So it's important to share these things and also be able to do that in a calm, respectful manner. So yes, in the same amount of breath, I'm a human being. So it's just really a bit raw for me because I did a piece yesterday, and it was really hard because you want to be able to speak about these things without, especially in the context of artwork and things, without it being mistaken or misinterpreted as leveraging trauma. That's just not the case. I think it's absolutely essential to talk about the experiences of the healing that's required and still required of our community. So I think for me, what is reconciliation is when we can speak about these experiences without being impacted by community that's just incredibly insensitive to it. And I was speaking in a space today about sustainability, and somebody had brought it. They decided to share that piece that I did, and it was auctioned. It was put on auction to support women in Web3. So I donated the piece. I wasn't gaining anything from it. They chose to bring it up, and in that context there was people that were actually being really very rude and aggressive. And it just goes to show, like, if somebody was in this room and they came up and they would say really aggressive things about trauma, and there's just a lack of sensitivity. And my point simply is that there is healing that has to be done on both sides, and so there needs to be that open discussion. And I think that's why we are at the Truth and Reconciliation Day as just a beginning to start to understand the need for education. So that's just my quick summary on that. I think we need to really identify some of the areas, and I'm happy to do that after Dan responds.
Amazing. Thank you, TP. Xael, thoughts?
I guess reconciliation for me has a lot to do with more of like people understanding the culture and taking an effort to understand the civilization and the origin of our indigenous people, before there was European contact and the effects of colonialism. Colonialism. And for me, there's always been a challenge entering certain workplaces simply because of just being indigenous. And it seems like it no matter where I go, there's always some sort of like attitude or some sort of behavior towards me just because of like my appearance or something like that, or there's always some sort of underestimation of like how intelligent can an Indigenous person be? So that's always been my issue when it comes to kind of like functioning in society as an Indigenous male. And when it comes to reconciliation, I think more people have to understand that a lot of the modern world comes from Indigenous teachings, and I think that's what reconciliation basically should be about, is a level of understanding, a level of moving forward, and above all, I think a level of being able to work together. And um I'm trying to speak really strong here because obviously there's a lot of uh trauma with colonialism, and why there's even reconciliation. And I'm really trying to hold my breath here. I'm trying to hold back those tears because it's a part of that warrior kind of personality you have to have when you become a support kind of person. And that's kind of the role I've been playing in the community for the past decade, is behind the scenes, behind the gaming, behind the tech, is working with youth. And the reconciliation should be for them, so that they could have a world that they could be free in. That's what reconciliation is, I think, to me, is the future. And I hopefully that kind of gives you an idea of how I feel about that.
1000%. Appreciate you sharing that genuine response. And TP, I was looking at your image on the Twitter here that shared a very profound piece. I don't want to mispronounce it, so I think it's in Cree. But what's really interesting on the blockchain as well, right? So not only is the amazing artwork that is the red dress over a scenic, I don't know if that's a Manitoba lake, or definitely looks like Canadian lake for sure, and just like really profound. And you got the Indigenous music in there, and it's just really amazing. We're going to leave a link for it on the description of the podcast as well, so that others can see it. It went and sold for 256 Tezos, so congratulations on that, because you do not see that many Tezos sales up in that range of amount. So very impressive. And I saw someone on Twitter commenting on how great it is to see that a piece like that would go for 256 Tez. So definitely congrats. So I wanted to highlight that. And I know you were mentioning there's other angles to reconciliation and how you view it. So please continue to share. And yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's hard. It's hard to be a creative. I always say you put your insides on your outside to be an artist, and to share stories and the way that you do it. For me, I love to do it with music and different kinds of movements. So it's a journey. It's a creative expression. So it's wonderful when people look at your artwork and say really powerful things. Like, somebody said something like in that post about it being one of the most powerful things that they've seen in Web3, and I just thought that's amazing. Like, that's a lot. So my family down there would know that piece. It's the one with the red dress, and it's over the lake. Um, so yeah. Thank you for acknowledging that. It's a journey. For me, the MMIW is part of which is Missing Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, Two Spirit. That is part. The way that I looked at the Truth and Reconciliation was four key areas. There was residential schools and survivors, and multi generational survivors. And then there was the MMIW, which is Missing Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two Spirit. There was also a 60s scoop, and that's relevant to me. I was on the class action suit against the government of Canada as an eligible recipient, so I spoke on that, and so that's relevant to me. And so you can speak about these things without it being like, not everything when I talk about the Truth and Reconciliation is specifically about trauma. For every amount of trauma, there's the celebration of identity. And I think we have to push through some of that. We have to find our balance. We have to find our That's, to me, is what the reconciliation aspect is as well. Like, I talked about the healing aspect. It's also to honor ourselves and honor our allies. So I think it's really important as creatives how we do that. quite often, and it's kind of interesting that I'm in Web3 and I speak about, you know, for anybody who doesn't really know much about Web3, it's all about tokens. And so to be an Indigenous person, isn't it? It's funny to be selling tokens and trying not to be treated as a token. So maybe people don't get my sense of humor.
Nah, I
anyways,
got you.
yeah.
I was laughing over here. I got you.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a challenge, and I find that quite often that I'm your token Indian, quite literally. And there's a few women that are actually. There's one gal who's another Indigenous person in Web3, and she's from I don't know, she's further south, United States, but her handle is token Indian. So it's pretty common. Quite often, there's a lot of conversations about sustainability, and I see it, and I've seen that quite often in the conversations as well, where the Indigenous aspect of our representation of sustainability and seventh generation teachings, for instance, is utilized to create validity and to create some sort of sense of intent, good intentions, by tokenizing our representation of our culture. So it's very interesting. I see it quite often. At the same time, I try to be very optimistic about it, and it does take patience to speak on these things. It takes patience to have other people not be responsive to the negativity of people. We take it on the chin, and as Dan said about the warrior spirit, is that means that we do have to take these things on the chin. It's really hard to represent the best things we can, and we're all fallible, right? So how do we do that with good intentions and still represent ourselves in a good way in our community? And I keep having to say that. I had a TP Tuesdays for the first time in probably about 6 months, which is exploring multicultural Indigenous communities around the world. And in that, there's a lot of people that come in that are still really, really hurting. And you can see that there's a need for emotional maturing. So yeah, it's a long road, I think, but I think it's a necessary road for us all.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing. You had mentioned allies and, being non-Indigenous myself, of multicultural background. And, I'm also a little bit of a political junkie, but I've always said it's really the social issues I saw around Indigenous people, growing up, frankly, in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and just the way others have talked about them and being racialized, quote unquote. I'm not a big fan of that word, but myself and having my own experiences, it always just kind of struck me. Everything both of you have just mentioned is really unfortunate. And so looking at that conversation around allyship and around other point you talked about how still bringing up the red dress, bringing up missing and murdered Indigenous women, bringing up the residential schools, unfortunately can often be met with either complete dismissal, so just lack of caring, lack of empathy, or worse, actually defending the actions of the colonial government. And so I think, at what point can reconciliation start without having the actual full consensus and understanding of society? Because unfortunately, and maybe I'm being too pessimistic, but my understanding and my perspective of this is that there's always going to be kind of a small segment of the population that is just not going to get it for whatever reason. Maybe it's religious, maybe it's some other version of indoctrination, but there's a lot of people out there who lack empathy and lack the desire to actually learn from history and to try to make things better going into the future. So I guess my question is, do we need consensus? And, how do we move things forward on an education basis without the consensus, and the understanding, among a broad swath of society that this is what we're working on and this is how we're going to kind of push society forward? I guess, what do you think, TP? How do you think we approach this? Because I just feel it's easy to get frustrated. It's easy to get discouraged, right? And we can say this about a myriad of different social issues, but specifically on this one, I really feel like there should be no partisanship. There should be no, opposition to really trying to heal the obvious wounds, right, of the past. So I don't know. What do you think about that topic of consensus? And really, like you said, we have to agree to reconcile first before we can actually reconcile, right?
Well, I think that it's an individual responsibility. It's a mental health issue. I think we have a responsibility and accountability to ourselves and our peers to do the best we can to represent ourselves well. And I think you can't drag somebody to the sweat lodge if they don't want to go. The sweat lodge being our healing place, which is like, it's, and I don't mean literally you have to come to the sweat lodge. I mean, people can educate themselves. Again, to my point about, is it my responsibility to educate other people? All I can do is humanize it and put in context the experience, right? So it's not my job to educate. There are people that undertake that in their roles as an ally. And I think it's important, number one, and I've said this because I do, in my experience of wanting to be a creative and working in film, is being an advocate of telling our own stories, wanting to write and paint and everything that I want to do. How do we do that in a creative way? And sometimes it means that people actually just have to tune in. They have to tune in and understand what we're saying and how we're saying it. And sometimes we're saying it with humor and tongue in cheek, because that's, first of all, it's a very OG Cree thing to it's a very OG Cree thing to just laugh at everything. If I talk to anybody in St. Teresa Point, for instance, it's just everybody starts laughing right off, and it's something that I picked up. It's quite. It does. Sometimes it could be taken as like somebody's laughing at you, and I'm like, no, it's not that. It's a cultural thing. So what can you do about that? It's like we have to give each other leeway to be who we are. And as much as I want people to understand who I am, do I put the best foot forward to understand who they are? I've often talked about I would never want somebody to feel the way that I felt. And I think that's an important lesson when we talk about international communities. So for me, people will tag me in things that are Indigenous. And I'm like, no, first off, I'm going to push back against that, being a vegan, being a punk rock, being somebody's not going to run around with a feather headdress on ever. It's never going to happen. I'm not your stereotype. And I want to be a contemporary voice in a contemporary society where people are putting as much effort into learning about others as they do about themselves. And I think it has to come even from the inside first. So that means being able to talk about the traumas in a way where so one of my experiences is cognitive, going through cognitive therapy about that, and understanding the need for, uh, there's a phrase called mnemonic recoding, which is retraining your brain in your default mode network. Sorry, I'm going to lose everybody here, but I actually spent a lot of time in my neurodivergence trying to figure out how do I heal myself. And it's working, I think. I think by the time I'm 80 and I'm an elder, I should be able to tell people how I did it.
I think you're good. You're coming through loud and clear, and amazing points. Dan, same question to you. Is the topic still too divisive? Do we need consensus, or like TP saying, kind of to each their own? We, just keep educating, keep pushing, but it's not, the job of Indigenous people for sure. And maybe certain allies will take it on as an initiative that they want to help spread education and awareness for. But how do you see that kind of struggle to continue pushing reconciliation forward and actually create real reconciliation while, obviously having to deal with some of the less understanding or empathetic voices out there?
So when it comes to like consensus of I guess like other people, I think there just has to be an acceptance that we're the original people on this land, and that no matter how much difficulties we go through, we're still going to be here. And I think that's what I think the consensus should be, is that we're always going to be here, and there's always going to be a treaty, and that's a peace treaty. That's peace between people so that we could work together. And yeah, I do believe in consensus. I believe in consensus of all nations, that one day, that all people are gonna work together, for the betterment of humanity. And that goes to that crazy horse teaching, the Lakota people, where he talks about all people are gonna be under one tree. He's talking about the Sundance, and that's important. That's a consensus teaching right there, that we all need to go to this understanding, this circle of life, this Mother Earth, and think about those kind of things. And yeah, there is a lot of tokenism I'll straight out, like tokenism, it's something that's always been there. Like, oh, you're an indigenous person, can you tell my fortune, or can you look in the future for me? Those kind of things. Could you heal me? Could you, take medicine off of me? Or does evil medicine work? Or do you have love medicine so I get this girl to like me? There's all kinds of tokenism ideas out there. And sometimes I guess the main idea is to be like, well, in order to get those kind of things, you have to put in effort. Like the teaching is, you have to say your prayer, but you have to actually go and act on what you said, to have that, that kind of thought pattern forward. And that's the kind of consensus that people need to kind of agree on. And when it comes to blockchain, the technology keeps improving, especially with Ethereum, reducing its energy consumption. That actually churned a lot of people to the idea of blockchain. Like, oh, a blockchain is actually a good idea, because Ethereum was able to reduce the power consumption with proof of stake. And when you really think about that it's just going to keep getting better as time goes on, because blockchain's only been around for about 15 or 14 years so far. And we got to think about the utility, like the treaty should be on the blockchain, those kind of things. Changes to the treaty should be on the blockchain, so we know when these changes happen. The signatures of people should be on these things with these decisions. And that's kind of the idea I was kind of getting into. Centralization has to do with the Indian agent in the reserve. We had to go to him, to get a pass to go into towns and cities. That's the idea of centralization, and still that centralization is still there. A lot of our people are isolated in communities, and just now, even thanks to blockchain, they're now getting access to the power of decentralization. So that's kind of like the consensus of both kind of people. Like, indigenous communities need to understand that there is a way to decolonize through decentralized blockchains, and there is a way to have power in your creativity. And if you look at the Inuit nation, they have their own artwork, and that artwork became Canada's national artwork. And I believe the Canadian government pumped a lot of money into that back in the 50s. So imagine if that was all on the blockchain. Imagine if we knew the artists of these carvings, these wonderful drawings, these mythologies we have no idea about yet. Blockchain could actually make it so that we're getting the right teachings, and not just some kind of teaching that came out of the concept of tokenism. So yeah, there is a need for everyone to kind of come to consensus and kind of agree to that. There is utility in the blockchain. There's also value, but that value comes from the utility, and that's decentralization. Hopefully that kind of answers the question.
Yeah, that was awesome. You also segued us into the tech conversation, so that's perfect. Definitely, yeah, I can see where you're coming from on that centralization, being really an oppressive tactic when put in that perspective, right? And the idea that entire communities were told they had to go to this office to get approval to do anything, and you needed to have this specific ID, to be able to be, qualify for certain benefits and this and that. That's definitely part of centralization. And I think even looking at modern day and the way that the current kind of payment system works, right, and the way that Indigenous funding for different communities and things are working, it's still very much held in the antiquated, traditional, colonial, if you will, power structure, right? And as you just mentioned, with blockchain, with the technology, there's an opportunity to really empower entire communities through the blockchain and less reliance on the traditional systems that, frankly, pilfer money, right? Like, they're still carving out money on the margins and making money off of payments that are supposed to go to communities, right? So great point and great segue. So with that, I do want to look at both of your NFT world. So Dan, Xael, you've got your peyote records, some NFTs on the blockchain, on the Ethereum blockchain there that we can talk about. And Tipi, along with me, back in early 2021, started the NFT experience. I think she mentioned in a prior meeting that her first NFTs were actually on Wax. I've never made an NFT on Wax, and I think I might have one or two actually, but very interesting. And I think you've mentioned, TP, that you're on like 12 different blockchains or something. So with that, first question, how can we use blockchain to advance reconciliation? And specifically, what are you doing to, play your part? And we'll start with TP, and then we'll turn over to Xael.
Okie dokie. Okay, first off, I think for the benefit of our audience, I would like to just kind of differentiate what blockchain means to me. I am somebody that onboards people, so I like to keep. I don't, as in the way of many of our Indigenous teachings, we don't speak above others. So I wanted to address what is blockchain technology first off, and how I see it, and would describe it to somebody who knows very little about it. Most people are on the internet, and you are making digital footprints. So if you had a way to get acknowledgement and or sell those digital footprints, uh, you know, you you can. So the idea of having a digital footprint for me and putting specific intent would be creating an NFT. So that footprint, you can decide how you want to sell it. You could say, oh, I want to sell it. Oh, some people are using that for clout, to get leverage on any kind of project they're on. Some people are leveraging that because they have partnerships with social media, for instance. Some people are, maybe say, even in LinkedIn here, where they're using their connections. So there's a lot of different ways we have a digital footprint that we're leaving, and there's different ways that we can market that. With Web3 and blockchain technology, basically you're creating a record that is your record. You're the one who's in charge of it. So imagine that for every single time you've posted something, it's yours. Anytime that you use social media, for instance, anytime you've put anything on the internet, it's all there. And so doing that with intent allows you to be somebody that's socially conscious, I think, because you're starting to be accountable to those. Imagine those conversations where we've all said, oh, when you put it on the internet, it's there forever. Well, it is, but you actually have ownership. So I would say that's what I see blockchain technology allows us to do. So it allows you ownership over your digital footprints. And I think that's really important. The next stage of that is when we talk about blockchain, there's a lot of different blockchains. If we just simplify it, let's keep it very simple. Fiat, your dollar, USD, Canadian dollar, euro, those are all kind of blockchains. There are systems. There's systems that we're using to give value. I mean, I'll give another perfect example. This is back to the reconciliation and understanding tokens and understanding value and barter. I just had a piece, and it looks like they're going to be dropping that one right away, probably as I speak right now. And it has to do with the Hudson Bay blanket. And so the made beaver was a token, and it was a way of bartering and trade. I'm not going to get into the breakdown of that because there's a lot of learning, and I'm just starting to educate people on what that meant for us as far as the Indigenous folks up here. There's a lot to unpack there. My way of doing that is to just start using some of the examples of that, the made beaver and the Hudson Bay blanket, in my artwork, and it's going to open up the doorway for discussions about that. But that's an example. Okay, so that the made beaver was a token. You could get sugar and flour and different things, different ammunitions and different things from Indigenous communities with the settlers here. So that's another example. So those are all like trade handshakes that we have. And so when we start utilizing our internet and our technology, it's just evolving. It's just another step in the evolution of how we're handling things. Digital currency is something that is part of the future. It's forecasting the future. It's already being utilized. It's just whether or not you want to have control over those mechanisms yourself, and or participate in the building of how that would look. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I'm going to just keep it simple there. So David mentioned wax. That's for me, that accountability to my teachings was really important. Understanding ESGs and impact, understanding the you wouldn't run your car, for instance. You're not going to run your car outside for hours just because you want to stay cool or hot or whatever, right? So you want to be conscious of your ecological footprint. So you can be environmentally conscious of your digital footprint as much as you could be as your ecological footprint in your home. What is your ecological footprint, what you're doing with your home. So all of that can be managed in tech. And it's been an important journey for me. I was a volunteer with Girls Who Code, teaching tech to younger women. I was also part of Mother Earth Recycling and really wanting to work with e-waste. And to the bane of my existence, I have ridiculous amounts of e-waste in my house because it's just amazing. I love it. I create art with e-waste. I was in Times Square as a featured headliner on a piece of with a piece of art that I created on Windows Photoshop 7 on a piece of computer equipment that I found in the snow and refurbished. So we can do a lot, and we can use our voice and we can make some changes. So that was the goal of why I literally came into Web3, wanting to be an insider activist in ESGs, and then decided that I really needed to learn. But not only that, be part of the process of voting and changing. So you can do that. You can be part of that process of changing from the inside out. So a lot of that again is self-education and or aligning with people that will take the time to speak with you and onboard you. And I think hopefully that's good enough. I didn't ramble too much.
When it comes to like creativity, like it's very important that people understand like what ownership is. And the blockchain just gives like it just automatically gives you ownership of whatever you put on there. And I guess that's like the main thing that people need to understand is that there is power that could be given to you beyond like what's like what you're raised with in terms of like fiat currency. Like some people, their ideas of money, it's like very like limited, I guess you could say. So they don't really think of the abstract idea behind money, that money is like just a record. Like the actual bill is a record of something on a ledger somewhere, and that ledger is run by a mint. And the whole financial system is relying on that one mint. So when I think people realize that the mint is not, you don't need the mint with blockchain. I think they don't realize that gives you that individual power. So decentralization, again, I always gonna say that it's gonna lead to more healing. And I guess like how I could incorporate this into the conversation is I founded the website podrecords.com, and the startup before that, it was called NAC Ceremonial Melodies, and that was for the Native American church. And it was because peyote songs, they're very, very very catchy melodies, and there's a prayer behind those songs. So people compose these songs all the time, almost just like right after a ceremony they'll compose like 4 or 6 songs, and it's just like, holy smokes, man, like that's a really good song, I want to sing that song. So then I guess when in the 90s, when these record companies kind of showed up, they wanted to publish these guys. And I guess like what the pioneers of peyote music in the modern world didn't realize is that when they signed a contract with the record, it's like they basically gave the ownership of these songs to those record companies, and those record companies own those songs. And these guys are wondering like okay, so like I'm famous, my songs are out there, but there's no value I'm getting out of it. Like I'm still in poverty. And they didn't realize that's part of colonialism. That's part of being reliant on centralization. And so that's was the idea behind it. And so I never used my personal identity when I interacted with the blockchain. I always go by a pseudonym. So when I did peyoterecords.com, it was actually the first time I interacted with like my real name. But I wanted Indigenous people to know about it, to at least learn about it, think about it, to start thinking about it, at least from my community, because the Native American church spans all throughout North America, like United States, all the way to Mexico, into Peru. So it's almost like you need to know Spanish as well as all these other languages. In order to be a peyote singer, you need to know what those songs mean. There's a like main chant that goes there, and then beyond that main chant, there's some words, there's prayers that are added to that. You need to know what those prayers mean, because those prayers have specific meanings and ceremonies, and someone could learn that song and they might not even know it's a Cree song. They might not even know it's an Ojibwe song. They just know that it's Indigenous, and they'll say, "Oh, that means Creator bless me." But meanwhile, it could be a funeral song, or you could be singing about something totally different, like a doctoring spirit, come help me, when it's really this guy's birthday. So you're calling in like a healing spirit in a doctoring ceremony. Those kind of things happen. I actually ran a ceremony for my dad one time, and somebody came there and sang a funeral song. I told them that in Lakota that those words that means that you're sending someone's spirit to the afterlife. And I don't know if you knew that. I told him, and I had to tell him that in the ceremony, and it was kind of a tough thing because he didn't understand what he was doing. And if there was a record somewhere that this song means that, maybe he would have knew. Like those kind of things are common mistakes. But with like blockchain, somebody could publish their song almost instantaneously, and they could say, "Oh, that song," like a language speaker could say, "That song means this. I learned this song at this ceremony." And then also, when I talk about the blockchain and NFTs, getting an album cover out there is almost built right into blockchain, because you're getting that NFT out there. So that's why I found on that website, peyoterecords.com. So these NFTs kind of become like album covers for these, hundreds of thousands of songs that these elders are composing at their ceremonies. And also too, they also argue with each other too sometimes. Like, "Hey, I made that song. How can you put that on a CD?" They argue like that too. I'm the one who made that song. They start arguing like that. "Oh, my uncle made that song." They start saying stuff like that. So at least with the blockchain, they say, "Hey, well, actually Uncle Gerald made that song. I was there when he made it. I was at that ceremony. I remember they were praying for Auntie Florence that time." So those kind of things are important. At least with a blockchain, no one could go back and change that data and say, "Hey, actually Uncle Verdell made that song. Gerald didn't make that song with Uncle Verdell." Those people's names is actually kind of like a token of famous peyote singers. I don't know if you know that, but if you research peyote music, there's actually hundreds of published songs that belong to different records. So peyoterecords.com, kind of a different approach, decentralizing the music so that someone can publish it almost instantaneously and they own it right away, instead of some entity or some person who's trying to tokenize Indigenous culture comes and says, "Hey, I'll publish those for you. I'll give you 10% of what I make off of it." That's kind of like the whole idea behind it. So it's difficult to it's difficult to explain that, like there's more value behind it than just like a monetary idea. Like there's more value behind it because you could prove something. You could prove that this happened at this point in time.
Yeah,
and that's kind of like the idea I'm trying to get at. Hopefully that kind of
certificate of authenticity is one way of framing it, or a timestamp of authenticity, right? Where it actually tells you the exact date and time that this person put this on the blockchain, with a description as well, so you can give all of those informations around who created something. Great point, Dan, and I think you're definitely onto something with Peyote Records. I noticed you got the Web3 Warriors plug on there too. I appreciate you. We've been connected in this space talking about some of these ideas for a little over a year now, so it's really cool and really a good use case. And I need to put you in contact with Hakeem Draper, who has been doing a lot of work on the Web3 and blockchain music side. He has a website called songsecure.com, and it's basically what you were just mentioning, really about using the blockchain to basically timestamp and certificate or authorize kind of IP, and basically say like, this artist created this beat, or I created this audio sample, whatever the case might be, on this date. So if you ever find it anywhere else, they have the bona fide proof because they put it on the blockchain, and it's already been used in court, and it's used it actually has a better weight in court than just having the what do you call it, copyright registration that you might pay a bunch for. But that actually has less weight than actually just showing proof of creation and the date that you created it. So definitely a good angle there. And I am going to put you in contact with Hakeem, because I think he'd love to hear about kind of the Indigenous perspective on that, and what you were saying about the different, chants and like spiritual music, essentially ceremonial music, and how having some authenticity behind that could go a long way internally for your communities. I think that's really powerful and a really interesting kind of angle as well. Tipi, I know we got a little bit of peyote records then, so that's an awesome angle for your project, Dan, and we can talk a little bit more about it. But Tipi, I also want to hear specifically about your projects, because you kind of started with some photography and really amazing, beautiful Manitoba photography on the blockchain, and then you've also now kind of gone into this TP-Fi, very cool, cyberpunk tech meets Indigenous culture. I'd love to hear just kind of how your NFTs, do you think they play a role in pushing reconciliation forward, or what's kind of the cultural purpose behind them, if you want to share a little bit of that? And thank you.
Oh, thank you for asking. Definitely. Okay, so as far as the photography, I call it land-based photography because I like to take pictures of the land. And I talk about, through this environmental science program, understanding that we have, as Indigenous, we have a different perspective that other people may have. Like our relationship to the land and the sky and the water is very, very genetically tied to our identity and our dreams, quite literally, and our oral traditions and ceremonies. So sometimes I'm taking shots of things, and I really like natural light. I'm trying to capture something very specifically that's that moment. So that's, maybe other people don't see it, and it's okay. I don't, it's everybody has their own prerogative. So again, it's a gentle way of saying, this is, I want to show you something, come and sit with me, right? So there's that. And I've been utilizing AI technology, which I call a series now. It's called TP-Fi, and TP-Fi is my Indigenous futurism, which there isn't a lot of in this space, and I don't even know. I just kind of was thinking about Afrofuturism, and I started using Indigenous futurism on tags. And I've read more about it since in the last year. Somebody was asking me about it, Indigenous futurism, and I was like, well, let's take a look. And I was reading one of the articles somebody had written that was from an Indigenous perspective, and the person said that we're surviving, these near genocides and post-apocalyptic survival. Indigenous communities are already surviving that. So my goal of, like, again, the tongue-in-cheek humor that I have, I use in my TP-Fi. So that is, it's Indigenous sci-fi. It's my take on sci-fi, and it's my healing journey. It brings me joy to do it, and create through the appreciation, breaking the stereotypes of Indigenous folks, and letting us be contemporary and futurist, right? Putting our teepees in space. And by the way, just for the purposes of anybody listening, I didn't call myself teepee. I called myself NFTP because I was thinking about the teepee outside of my IRL in real life artist co-op, Indigenous artist co-op here in Manitoba. And then friends that were Korean had a harder time with the Clarina, and some of my international friends had a harder time, so they just started calling me TP. So it stuck. I've been TP for 3 years now, so I love it. Sometimes I forget. And I like want to call my mom and go, "Hi, it's TP. I mean, it's Karina." So, yeah, the artwork is I love it. It brings me total joy to do some blending, but also like really take stock of what's happening in the world. And I use blockchain technology also. Say, going back to my photography pieces, there was a piece of a teepee in the woods that was one of the first mints I did. And it was really acknowledging on Canada Day in 2021 when our flags were at half mast, because of the recognition of the residential school and impact, and the discovery of bodies behind the school residential schools. So I really wanted to put that date on the blockchain. I also did when the Pope apologized. I took quotes on that day, and I put a teepee film bit, and it was so fascinating. There was like this kind of, it sounded like a cowbell in the background. It was so fitting, kind of like this recognition of the church and the impacts to communities, and quoting the Pope. on that particular day. So it's interesting that we can use blockchain technology. And I keep saying, we can use that for our dates. Again, that's that digital footprint. It's the same thing where, we used to use, and I've said this before to other friends, but you use microfiche. And if you're going to, say, the Manitoba Archives and you want to look up information, well, where is that information now? It's not accessible. There, I actually wanted to look up look up some photography that would be fair use within copyright, as far as the Hudson Bay information and things like that. And I have no access to it. I have to go down there. So that's just really understanding what our technology allows us access to information, and understanding, um, you know, access to education as well, access to culture. I do want to put the caveat in there that through the teachings, the Medewan teachings, that I've been taught, that there's sacred knowledge that we wouldn't put on the blockchain. Others would. Again, I'm not the sacred police. I've said that often in TP Tuesdays. I'm not the sacred police, nor am I the cultural appropriation police either. So don't report to me. I don't know about that. Again, we have autonomy and free will, so I have no idea what people get up to, the shenanigans that people get up to, as far as, even thinking about somebody saying, "Well, I put it on the blockchain, therefore it's mine." That's not necessarily true. It can be. There's still a lot of regulations to look through, and there's still a lot of international regulations happening, and there's still a lot of impact to access to technology in sanctioned countries. There's a lot of things to break apart in this ecosystem. So I think it's really great, though, that hopefully we're building that kind of highway, that technical highway, where we can have access to information as we want it. Again, it's probably scary for a lot of people, because it means that maybe we can't hide either. So some of us may want to disconnect, and that's still an option. But anyways, I like the idea of creating that digital footprint on the currency that I like, having that exchange happen, that barter exchange for, as a token for a token, much like the Made Beaver. Have those conversations and continue to evolve. I want to be a contemporary Indigenous person that is changing the genetic makeup, and surviving, and changing that trauma for my children and their children, and my community. So it's really important to be contemporary and not be a stereotype for me. So creating sci-fi artwork. And I want to say this, 'cause since my mom is in the audience, and my brother and Sage, they're one of the pieces I created was with some video that my mom had given me of the family in 1958 or something, and I TP-fied it. There's an alien invasion happening in the middle of it, and I can't wait to share it with my family. So, yeah, it'll be really fun. It's just an example of what we can do with blockchain technology. We can do and create what we want. We have access to technology, we have access to information, and then we can create those to sell, and create self sovereignty. And that's the goal for me, and trying to build outside of the art world, in the environmental, sustainable aspect. It's like, what can we do with this technology? And it's my goal to offer solutions to Indigenous communities in the North. Not only that, to break the stereotypes of Indigenous women in tech. I know that our northern communities offer some programming for women in tech. And I want to seize that opportunity and elevate those voices to change the stereotype and narratives for Indigenous women. So, yeah. Hmm.
Amazing, amazing. So what I'm hearing from both of you is really uplifting and empowering creators, artists, musicians. And so, of course, that can have awesome ripple effects kind of throughout the communities and throughout society. On the point of reconciliation and kind of healing, do you think that, as these tools become more accessible, or even it's just like us raising awareness of it, having these conversations, maybe hosting some workshops in the future around, trying to reach out to communities and really empower people with these tools of Web3, maybe starting with UTP on the healing side, do you think that this is going to play a big role in healing? Like, do you think that having, amazing Indigenous futurism art that's really pushing a conversation around, like you said, being a contemporary Indigenous person with your own perspectives and thoughts that don't fit, any stereotypes, or not, trying to be pigeonholed into one thing or another, is it creating that healing? Do you think that this has a potential, these NFTs have a potential to do that? And then we'll have the same question to Xael, but is that something we're working on? Do you think that's gonna help TP?
Definitely it will. I'm just thinking about oh, hang on a second. I've got to regroup. I had it on the tip of my I had it sorted out and then I got distracted. Can we go to Dan or
Yeah, no
Xael first?
problem.
Let me
Dan, how do
get
you
my
think?
I was like, oh, it's so good. I wanted to acknowledge an elder, but I lost it.
Okay, and Dan, yours is specifically peyote, which is a medicine in and of itself, right? And then you're kind of mixing in the music, and then you also have art, kind of that has peyote kind of intertwined in there. What are your thoughts on the healing aspects of these NFTs?
So I guess like when it comes to healing, a lot of people they want to have the understanding of their identity, and I think that's a part of healing too. So when it comes to healing, I think like it has more to do with how someone will feel about themselves, how they're gonna self-actualize with themselves, and like I said, you're giving power to people to like publish their creativity, and that itself is powerful because that someone could put that on there and it's there forever, knowing that it's going to be there forever. That's powerful for somebody that that's their name. All of us, we have an Indigenous name. We don't like TP was saying. There's some things that are very sacred, and our Indigenous spiritual names is one of those things too that are very sacred, and when someone identifies with their spiritual name, they want to put the best of what they know of themselves in that. And I think NFTs kind of would help that, like this artwork here, there's a spiritual eye to artwork, like they have a specific meaning. And if you're an artist, you kind of know, like you kind of see kind of images everywhere and textures and stuff like that, and you kind of, it's like a third eye sort of. So being able to put that out there, someone 1,000 years from now could look back at that and be like, hey, this artist painted this thing here, and there's this one aspect to this artwork that helps me, it helps me understand myself. Maybe this person's from the same clan as me. Maybe this person has the same kind of experience I had in life. That's kind of like the healing aspect I talk about when it comes to like identity, is relatability. Because our identity comes from influence, like we get influenced by each other, by our mom, our dad, or our sisters, or brothers, our aunties, uncles. We get influenced by those parental figures and family figures, and that becomes a part of our identity, and that's where we learn how to talk, how to communicate with the world, and that's kind of like the healing aspect. And I guess like when it comes to systems too, like financial systems, and I guess like trust is a big thing, and blockchain is made as 100% kind of trust-based system. Like no matter what, that trust is there. You just have to hold on to your private keys and make sure no one knows your private keys, and you're good. Make sure no one hacks you. You could do that with getting a little notebook and using that for everything blockchain, and just leaving that separate from everything. But that's just a little cybersecurity tip, when it comes to protecting your identity, because it's easy for someone to impersonate you in a centralized world. You see a lot of people faking profiles nowadays. So I even heard someone advertising someone else's store and then giving them a link to a different thing and affecting them with viruses. At least with like a decentralized model, somebody, you'd know that person's authentic, and that profile or that identity is the real thing, and that whatever you purchase on the identity is going to be that same art. And there's one other project I'm working on, and it has to do with helping people up north again have access to decentralization, and using the NFT as kind of like a receipt system. Like this artwork existed at this time. It was a statue of a bear, the bear clan, bare teaching, is on that